If you've been watching my videos, it'll come without much of a surprise that I'm a huge fan of the 80s and 90s. Maybe it's because I was born in the 80s and it just has a nostalgic effect on me, but at the same time it's pretty undeniable that there was a certain way of making movies throughout the 80s and the first half of the 90s that just doesn't compare to cinema of nowadays. The difference isn't as evident in big budget movies, but much more prevalent in lower budget films. I really do feel that it's digital cinema that might be the culprit. Lighting digital versus film is very different, and digital lets people get away with much more. So on lower budget films, as long as the picture looks clean, it passes. I do love digital film, it's just that most of the time only bigger productions really take the time to light movies in a real cinematic fashion. In the 80s and 90s, no matter how big the budget of the movie was, people would be forced to light it adequately, otherwise filming would simply not work. That being said, I'm not trying to analyze 80s, 90s cinema versus today's movies. What I want to focus on is some of my favorite films from that era that really influenced me as a kid and young adult. The first movie I'd like to speak about is The Goonies, produced by Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment. Released in 1985, if you were a kid during that era, this was the ultimate adventure that any child from the 80s would have loved to be a part of. Richard Donner, the director of the films, noted both the difficulties and pleasures of working with so many child actors. He praised them for their energy and excitement, but also said that they were also unruly when brought together. To keep the kids in check, Donner restricted the actors from seeing the formidable life-size ship until they filmed the scene wherein it is revealed to their characters. The characters' first glimpse of the ship was also the actors' first view of it, bringing about a more realistic performance. However, that particular scene in the final cut was actually the second take, due to the cast feeling so overwhelmed at first sight that the scene had to be reshot. As for The Goonies, the movie is set in the Goondocks area of Astoria, Oregon, where the people living there are facing foreclosure to an expanding country club. A group of children who call themselves the Goonies gather for a final weekend together. While rummaging through the Walsh's attic, they come across a 1632 doubloon and an old treasure map that could possibly lead them to the treasure of legendary pirate One-Eyed Willie, believed to be located somewhere nearby. Deciding to go on an adventure, the group quickly discovers that the derelict restaurant is a hideout of the Fratelli crime family. The Goonies find a tunnel in the basement of that restaurant and follow it, but when Chunk flags down a motorist to go to the sheriff's station, he gets abducted by the assailants and imprisoned with their hulking deformed younger brother, Sloth. Reaching the grotto where Willie's pirate ship, the Inferno, is anchored, the group discovers the ship is filled with treasure and they start filling their pockets with that treasure, but Mikey warns them not to take any on a set of scales in front of Willie, considering that to be their tribute to him. Another problem arises throughout the story where the Fratelli brothers and their mom are hunting down the kids and the treasure in order to keep it for themselves. The film was so popular that it grossed $124 million worldwide on a budget of $19 million and has since become a cult film. It's not much of a surprise that this movie was so popular, as it basically depicted the perfect adventure that any kid would love to go on. Plus it presents itself with the perfect blend of scare, action, and adventure that in some way isn't too childish for adults to watch, but also not too scary for children to get nightmares. The second movie that I'd like to speak about is The Karate Kid. Yes, this movie has become a franchise spawning many sequels and even a really popular TV show airing right now on Netflix, featuring much of the original cast, but the first Karate Kid is where the magic sauce was invented for the Karate Kid saga. On an interesting note, The Karate Kid is a semi-autobiographical story based on the life of its screenwriter Robert Mark Kamen. At age 17, after the 1964 New York World's Fair, Kamen was beaten up by a gang of bullies. This made him begin to study martial arts in order to defend himself. Being unhappy with his first teacher who taught martial arts as a tool for violence and revenge, he moved on to study Okinawan Goju-Ryu karate under a Japanese teacher who did not speak English, but was himself a student of Chojun Miyagi. The plot of the film focuses on a 17-year-old Daniel Russo and his mother Lucille, who moved from New York, New Jersey to Reseda, California. Their apartment's handyman is an eccentric but kind and humble Okinawan immigrant named Mr. Miyagi. Trying to fit into his new school, Daniel befriends Allie Mills, a high school cheerleader, which draws the attention of her arrogant ex-boyfriend Johnny Lawrence, a black belt and the top student from the Cobra Kai dojo, where he studies a vicious form of karate. Johnny and his Cobra Kai gang continually bully Daniel. On Halloween, after Daniel sprays water on Johnny with a hose, he and his gang pursue Daniel down the street and brutally beat him up, until Mr. Miyagi intervenes and single-handedly defeats them with ease. Amazed, Daniel asks Mr. Miyagi to teach him karate. Mr. Miyagi does accept to take Daniel under his wing, which leads Daniel to learn about compassion. Through Mr. Miyagi's techniques, we also find out the real motivator behind Johnny Lawrence's and his boys' violent attitude, which basically stems in the form of their karate teacher. Mr. Miyagi promises to teach Daniel karate and arranges a fight at the All Valley tournament on the condition that the bullying stops. In the end, this movie is much more than a plain karate film. It's a movie that shows heart and is really focused on human relationships. Mr. Miyagi becomes much more than a teacher to Daniel LaRusso. He is like a father figure and mentor to him, showing him the right path to a successful life. Back in the 80s, this kind of concept was very new, but it has been copied in hundreds of films since then. In the end, what made these movies powerful is not the action sequences, for which there really aren't many. The forte of this film is the human interaction and the growth in the characters from the beginning of the film in contrast to the ending. The third movie that hugely influenced me as a child is Ghostbusters. This movie was inspired by Dan Aykroyd's fascination and belief in the paranormal. This fascination was inherited from his family that was heavily into the paranormal too. In 1981, Aykroyd read an article on quantum physics and parapsychology in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, which gave him the idea of trapping ghosts. Being drawn to the idea of modernizing the comedic ghost films of the mid-20th century made by teams like Abbott and Costello in Hold That Ghost, Bob Hope in The Ghost Breakers, and the Bowery Boys in Ghost Chasers, as for Ghostbusters, the movie follows Peter Venkman, Ray Stantz, and Egon Spenkler, who work at Columbia University, where they specialize into the paranormal and fiddle with many unethical experiments on their students. As they are kicked out of the university, they decide to start a business of their own focused on the paranormal. Under the new snazzy business name of Ghostbusters and living in the old firehouse building they work out of, they are called to rid New York City of paranormal phenomenon at everyone's whim for a price. They make national press as the media reports the Ghostbusters are the cause of it all. Thrown in jail by the EPA, the mayor takes a chance and calls on them to help save the city. Unbeknownst to all, a long-dead Gozer worshipper erected a downtown apartment building which is the cause of all the paranormal activity. They find out the building could resurrect the ancient Hittite god Gozer and bring an end to all humanity, and therefore must do everything in their power to take him on. Boy, back in the 80s, Ghostbusters was all the rage, from toy lines to costumes to cartoons. Ghostbusters was pretty much everywhere and pretty much any kid was a fan of them. This is again a great illustration about how a movie can be slightly scary but also acceptable for kids. And in pure simplicity, like many of the films from that era, the movie was pleasing from a special effects perspective, but the whole film is still carried on by the actual relationships of the characters. Sometimes VFX nowadays are overused and the plots are pretty much non-existent, which is sad because in order to create timeless classics such as Ghostbusters, the most important thing is to have a great script. The fourth movie that I'd like to speak about is Stand By Me. The film was adapted from the Stephen King novella, The Body. Principal photography began on June 17, 1985 and ended in late August 1985. Parts of the film were shot in Brownsville, Oregon, which stood in for the fictional town of Castle Rock. The town was selected for its small-town 1950s ambience. Approximately 100 local residents were employed as extras. Rob Reiner, who directed the film, identified most with the character of Grody, so he took on liberties in changing the original novel's focus that was about 4 boys and made Gordy the central focus of the piece. It just made sense to him. This movie was all about a kid who didn't feel good about himself and whose father didn't love him. Stand By Me tells the story of 4 Argonne boys who decide to go see the body of a dead man after learning that a stranger has been accidentally killed near their rural homes. On the way, Gordy Lachance, Vern Tessio, Chris Chambers, and Teddy Duchamp encounter a mean junk man and a marsh full of leeches as they also learn more about one another and their very different home lives. Just a lark at first, the boys' adventure evolves into a defining event in their lives. Upon its release, the film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay and 2 Golden Globe Awards, one for Best Drama Motion Picture and one for Best Director. I think that this movie primarily hits hard to boys as it is a true coming-of-age film. The main cast starts out as children, but through their adventure they end up becoming men. And again, like many of the movies I've listed, even though the premise is dark and it tackles many deep subjects, the way it is presented can be easily followed by a younger audience as well as enjoyed by adults without having to dumb down the message. Obviously, seeing a dead body and some of the other subjects that it tackles might not be suitable for smaller kids, but for younger boys around the same age as the cast, it's totally relatable and the sort of adventure that a young teen would only dream of going on. The 5th and last movie that I want to speak about is Back to the Future, and not just the first movie, but the whole trilogy as a whole. This movie was really the defining saga of my childhood, watching the series every time I had the opportunity to do so. The movies follow the adventures of time-traveling high school student Marty McFly and inventor Dr. Emmett Brown as they travel throughout several time periods in the past 1955 and 1885, present 1985, and future 2015. The first movie was the highest grossing movie of 1985 and became an international phenomenon, leading to 2 sequels which were filmed back-to-back and released in 1989 and 1990 respectively. The trilogy is widely noted for its irreverent comedy, eccentric characters, and ability to incorporate complex theories of time travel without confusing the audience. And if we're speaking about adventures that are pretty much exciting for any age, this is the top 1 movie that manages to do that. Almost 40 years after the release of the initial film, the Back to the Future saga is still relevant to this day. Interestingly enough, the idea of the film started when Bob Gale, one of the writers of the movie, visited his parents and came across his father's high school yearbook. Gale questioned whether he and his father would have been friends had they attended school together. He did not think so, but realized he could test his theory if he could travel back to a time when he and his parents were of similar age. He shared the idea with Robert Zemeckis, the director of the trilogy, who recalled his mother's childhood stories were often contradictory to what she was saying. In some ways, time travel is the ultimate power, and when combined together with an endearing story that transcends decades, this is where the film struck gold. It simply makes it relatable to pretty much anyone on Earth. But I've probably spoken enough about Back to the Future in this video. If you want a more in-depth analysis on the film, I did make a video specifically dedicated to this movie on my channel. I'll put a link to that video in the description of this video. Well, this concludes my top 5 defining films of my childhood. Really, most of these films have many points in common with each other. The most defining one is that they always speak about relationships with the people around us, and many have elements of coming of age. Maybe this is why they are so touching, especially for young people who are growing up watching them. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Please be sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Let me know what your favorite movie is. It doesn't have to be from the 80s or early 90s. That's my taste, but I'm always willing to explore other people's favorites. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.